What is going on, everybody? In today's video, we will be breaking down 5 must-draft wide receivers that I think you need to start targeting as soon as possible. Whether these players are going to be rising in ADP between now and August, whether I've already seen them start to rise in ADP throughout the offseason, or whether they're just a great value where they are being drafted. These are 5 wide receivers that need to be on your radar and guys that you need to start drafting right away. So if you guys are new to the channel, this is all we do here all year long. Free fantasy football content, redraft, dynasty, and best ball. If you guys are into that, hit that subscribe button down below, and let's hop right into today's video. All right, first on the list, I've got Christian Watson of the Green Bay Packers, currently going at an ADP of 69.2 on Underdog. He has really moved up in the offseason in terms of ADP on Underdog Fantasy. And then on Sleeper, he's currently going at an ADP of 101. So in sleeper mock drafts, you're able to draft Christian Watson a lot of the time as wide receiver 4 or 5, which I think is fantastic. And in the right builds, you can still draft Christian Watson as a wide receiver 4 in Underdog Fantasy drafts. Once again, fantastic. But I am telling you guys, come the middle of the month of August, Christian Watson is going to move up in ADP, I think, another 9 to 10 spots. I mean, he is really a player that I am seeing being drafted aggressively and before his ADP, especially in Underdog drafts. And there are enough fantasy managers out there who are already big fans of Watson and that potential upside that he brings to the table that they're already making him parts of their roster all over the place. So Watson, I am just seeing really aggressively being drafted, and I think for good reason, right? Okay, the hamstring issues, we get it. The injury issues, we get it. But man, this Green Bay offense is just so young, looked so good in Jordan Love's first full season as a starter that I think so many people just don't want to miss out on the what if. What if Christian Watson is fully healthy, or it's just healthy for 12 to 14 games this season? Just imagine the potential ceiling he brings in terms of fantasy points on a week out basis. When he was healthy last year, I mean, don't get me wrong, there was a stretch that was not good between week 7 and week 10 where he scored under double-digit fantasy points in all of those performances, but every other time he hit the field when he was healthy, 5 other games, he gave you 10.5 or more fantasy points. So those last 2 games, especially when it felt like, oh, Christian Watson is really actually healthy, at Detroit, 20.4 fantasy points. And then the week after at home against Kansas City, 27.6 fantasy points. And then boom, he's gone for the rest of the season. So listen, this is an offense with a lot of really good wide receivers that I think you could potentially put on a list like this. Guys like Diontae Wicks, even Romeo Doubs going at a really good ADP. Then Jaden Reed going a little bit earlier. The player that I find myself drafting the most of just for that massive ceiling that we know Christian Watson brings to the table once again is Christian Watson, right? You go back to that rookie season, what he was able to do once he got, really going, once again, was fully healthy and fully utilized within that offense. We just saw on a tremendous tear. Go back and look at those stats from 2022 and get close to that anywhere between 10, 12, 14 games this season. He is going to more than pay off at his current ADP. So I'm seeing fantasy players all over the place go after Christian Watson. This has been a trend throughout the offseason that's not going to change. Even if other players on this offense like Diontae Wicks are also quite trendy right now, don't be surprised if Christian Watson moves up another drastic couple spots in ADP. Go out and draft him right now. All right, next up on the list, I've got Diontae Johnson, now with the Carolina Panthers, currently going at an ADP of 71.9 on Underdog Fantasy and at an ADP of 93.7 on Sleeper. So once again, similar to Christian Watson, a little bit higher in Underdog Fantasy drafts where wide receiver is more heavily targeted, but in sleeper mock drafts right now, he is just an absolute steal. And once again, similar to Christian Watson, a player you can draft as a wide receiver 4 in the right builds, and sometimes even land as a wide receiver 5. Listen, lots of people, I think, looking at this Carolina Panthers offense and just shaking their heads like, no, I don't want any part of this. It was an awful offense last year. I get that. Bryce Young's rookie season was a disaster, but this is not the first time we have seen a rookie quarterback not have a good rookie season or live up to expectations as a number one overall selection in the NFL draft, right? And Dave Canales coming from, doing very good things with Baker Mayfield last year and then doing very good things with Geno Smith the previous season. He is going to really have the opportunity to work with Bryce Young in this offense and turn things around. There's other skill position players on this offense now, whether you look at Jonathan Brooks at the running back position, whether you look at Xavier Leggett, and even Jatavion Sanders at tight end. You still have Adam Thielen, which shake your head if you want, but Thielen was pretty dang good to start the fantasy season last year. There are other playmakers around Diontae Johnson and around Bryce Young to help improve this offense, right? So I do like that sometimes. Like you look at that, maybe it's like, oh, well, that's less targets for Diontae Johnson, but there's actually just less pressure and less defensive pressure because there are going to be other playmakers on this offense, believe it or not, right? But the point being is that Diontae Johnson is a very good wide receiver. And I think he's coming off a season where he missed some time. So some people don't really realize, like, oh, Diontae Johnson is actually a super consistent wide receiver when it comes to full PPR scoring. And on top of that, it's not like he had great quarterback play last year when he was healthy. But outside of that, Diontae Johnson, you look at reception perception, right? A great overall reception perception chart. He is just a good wide receiver going to a team that, once again, Adam Thielen last year, when you break things down, there was a point last year where Adam Thielen was a top 10 fantasy wide receiver. Between weeks 1 and week 8, he had 15.2 or more PPR points in every game except for week 1. Okay, Diontae Johnson's going to fit right into that wide receiver 1 role. He should absolutely feast within this offense, and I always say it, right? Okay, bad offenses still produce good fantasy players. So even if you don't care about anything I just said about the Carolina Panthers offense having the chance to improve and Bryce Young having the chance to improve, Diontae Johnson can still present a ton of value, especially in PPR scoring formats. He is an absolute steal at his current ADP of 71.9 on Underdog Fantasy, and even more of a steal on Sleeper, going at an ADP of 93.7. Add him to your draft boards right now. Next on the list, I've got Rashee Rice of the Kansas City Chiefs. I have talked about Rashee Rice a lot throughout the offseason, and I am still a big fan of drafting Rashee Rice, which, I've talked about this literally since the offseason began, and I got a lot of heat for this at the beginning of the offseason. Like, how can you even consider drafting Rashee Rice when he's going to be suspended? Well, we don't actually know that he's going to be suspended for the 2024 fantasy football season, or regular season, I should say. It might not be until the 2025 NFL season that he faces the suspension. Similar, if you look at the Alvin Kamara situation 2 years ago, where Kamara wasn't suspended until last season, we could see something like that. But even if he is suspended this season at the ADP he's going, I don't really care, because similar to the last 2 wide receivers we just talked about, you can draft him as a wide receiver 4 or wide receiver 5. And I think he's not going to get hit with more than a 4 to 6 game suspension. And it might even come down to a 3 to 4 game suspension, where it gets kind of minimized there. And at the end of the day, this is Patrick Mahomes, one of Patrick Mahomes' top playmakers. And I like Hollywood Brown. I like the potential upside of Xavier Worthy. Travis Kelce's there, I get it. But when you break things down, Rashee Rice in this system, an added year compared to Xavier Worthy and compared to Hollywood Brown, he is the security blanket outside of Kelsey, security blanket at wide receiver for Patrick Mahomes. And they just gained a ton of trust last year. In his rookie season, he had 5 games where he did not give you double-digit fantasy points in full PPR. Every other game, double-digit fantasy points for Rashee Rice. A very solid rookie season with just under 1,000 receiving yards at 938 receiving yards and 7 receiving touchdowns. Patrick Mahomes, with some of the difficulty they faced at wide receiver last year, is not going to forget about this in Rashee Rice's sophomore season. So literally, if Rashee Rice was not facing a potential suspension, he would be going literally probably at least 20 picks earlier, if not 25 to 30 picks earlier. So he is an absolute bargain where he's being drafted right now. And you really need to think about taking advantage of the fact that he may or may not face a suspension this year, and that is affecting his draft capital at the moment, his ADP at the moment. And that could actually really work out for a lot of fantasy managers. So get Rashee Rice on your draft boards where he is currently going. If this ADP changes too much, maybe we could have a different conversation, but where he's currently going in mock drafts and underdog drafts, he's a steal. Don't forget, I run several streams throughout the week where I go round by round and show you guys how I throw together underdog teams. If you guys are ready to draft and you don't want to wait any longer, go ahead and hop in some underdog drafts. These are the most competitive fantasy football drafts going on right now, and they will continue to be the most competitive moving into the month of August. This will get you guys fully prepared for your upcoming fantasy football drafts, for your redraft season. This will get you guys tuned into those later rounds and get you just feeling fully prepared to smash mock drafts in your home leagues as well as your redraft season overall. Don't forget promo code the catch. Link is down below as well. Gets you a first time 50% deposit match up to $250 on Underdog Fantasy. All right, next up on the list, another player that I've talked about a lot throughout the offseason, Chris Godwin, currently going at an ADP on Underdog at 58.7, and then on the Sleeper app, a ADP of 74.3. Listen, I'm all for Chris Godwin, okay? I think he's going to have kind of a bounce back season compared to last year, where he finished as the wide receiver 29 in full PPR, but he still hit over 1,000 receiving yards, 2 receiving touchdowns. That doesn't feel great, you have to admit, but 130 targets is the big thing here, okay? Yes, Mike Evans made the most of his targets last year, okay? Mike Evans was the guy he wanted in fantasy. He had 13 receiving touchdowns last year. I get all that, but Mike Evans, just 6 more targets than Chris Godwin in this offense last year, okay? We talked about Dave Canales earlier. He's now with the Carolina Panthers. Maybe that affects Baker Mayfield in this offense next year, but honestly, on paper, this offense should look pretty much identical to what it was last year. There's no reason to think this offense is going to change moving into the 2024 season. But the Buccaneers, have already come out and said that they're going to get Chris Godwin more involved this year compared to last year. And they're going to be using him in the slot more, which is where he really shines as a player. So I think a lot of people just down on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers offense outside of Mike Evans right now. And I think ADP really reflects that. Even when you look at guys like Rashad White, who was a top 5 fantasy back last year, and Baker Mayfield, who was a top 10 quarterback, so I think Godwin is just a steal at his given ADP, like every player on this list. And he is a player who I am seeing in underdog drafts getting drafted a little bit more aggressively. So I think he is someone who should be on a lot more fantasy managers' radars because he might move up a couple spots in ADP where he's currently being drafted. So Godwin, yet again, just another steal at his current ADP. Get him on your draft boards as we approach the month of August. All right, last but not least, one of my favorite players year in and year out is Christian Kirk of the Jacksonville Jaguars, currently going at an ADP of 44.1 on Underdog with an ADP of 63.9 on the Sleeper app. So when you look at Christian Kirk last year, got hurt in week 13. Okay, so let's look at weeks 1 through 12. He gave you single-digit fantasy performances just 3 times. Christian Kirk is a PPR machine, a PPR monster. Like last season and the year before, 2 of my most talked about wide receivers in the offseason were Christian Kirk and Devonta Smith. These are the 2 guys that I always look at as like just models of consistency at the wide receiver position in full PPR scoring formats. But, Devonta Smith didn't really fall off due to injury last year, and his quarterback wasn't hurt towards the end of the year. And his quarterback still finished as the QB2 in fantasy last year and is tied to arguably a better offense in the Philadelphia Eagles, so he's going at a much higher ADP. And at the end of the day, Devonta Smith is probably still a better wide receiver than Christian Kirk, but Christian Kirk is still a great wide receiver, and more importantly, he is a wide receiver 1 for his respective team, right? Okay, I know Brian Thomas Jr. is there. He's going to get, looks. He's going to be part of this offense. He's a good prospect. I like Brian Thomas Jr. Okay, I like Evan Ingram. I think he's one of the most underrated tight ends in fantasy football. They add Gabe Davis, whatever. Okay. Christian Kirk is the guy here. He is the security blanket for Trevor Lawrence. He has the chemistry with Trevor Lawrence. And, you go back to what he did in 2022, right? He was a wide receiver 11 in full PPR, 8 receiving touchdowns, over 1,100 receiving yards, 133 targets, 84 receptions. If he's fully healthy, I still think that is 100% doable. That 2022 season was a season for the Jaguars where, at the end of the day, probably their best offensive performances under the Trevor Lawrence era easily, right? And you look back to last year, a lot of these double-digit performances, they still came while Calvin Ridley was part of this offense, and now Calvin Ridley is no longer on this team with the Tennessee Titans. So even if Brian Thomas Jr. is your argument for like, I think he's going to be the guy, I don't want to take shares of Christian Kirk where he's being drafted. Well, Kirk was able to hit literally 13.9 or more fantasy points in every game last year, except for those ones that we pointed out, then a 12.9 performance in week 12 or more points, right? A ceiling of 21.9 points in week 2 against Kansas City for Christian Kirk. With Calvin Ridley there, with Evan Ingram there, with a good run game with Travis Etienne. So I love Kirk. Once again, if you plan things correctly, especially in underdog drafts, you can come out with Kirk as your wide receiver 4. He is, kind of rising in ADP. Maybe not rising, but I do think, he has the highest ADP of any player out of the players we talked about today. So keep an eye on him because he might kind of move into that, area where you have to draft him as a wide receiver 3 depending on how training camp goes and how much potential hype we get around the Jacksonville Jaguars. So if he stays at this ADP or if he drops, I think he's just an absolute steal, does not get enough credit. And the big reason why he's not getting credit moving into this season is because he missed weeks 14 through 18 and the Jaguars did not make the playoffs, right? So this is an offense being semi slept on, but Christian Kirk just always slept on. Get him on your draft boards moving into the month of August. That'll do it for today's video. If you guys did enjoy the content today, be sure to subscribe on the way out. It really does help out the channel. And this is all we do here all year long. Free fantasy football content, redraft, dynasty, and best ball. If you're into that, join the community, hit that subscribe button down below. And of course, leave me a comment down below. Let me know what players you guys are considering as must draft wide receivers at their current ADP. Who are you guys targeting in drafts? And what do you guys think of today's list as well? If you guys have any fantasy football questions, redraft, dynasty, best ball, whatever it may be, drop them down below. I'll get back to you when I can as well. With that, I will say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.